White privilege.
What?
Think about it. Whose flesh tone is this?
Oh,
I have brown Band-Aids in my classroom. I had to special order them. They're twice as much as these, and they're hard to find, and they're frequently out of stock. But when I hand a brown child a white Band-Aid, I am literally adding insult to injury, and I refuse to do that in my classroom.
Really? Seriously? One, let's say that you're a maker of Band-Aids. It turns out the vast majority of people in the United States are white. If you're making only one type of Band-Aid, or predominantly one type of Band-Aid, that type of Band-Aid is going to be more common and cheaper if it matches the skin tone of the majority of the population. I would imagine that if you were a Band-Aid maker in Africa, you're presumably making Band-Aids that look closer to the skin tone of the people who live in Africa. But apparently this is now racism. When my kids wear Band-Aids, they wear Band-Aids with like Paw Patrol on them. Is that because they have Paw Patrol skin?
The look on his face, to me, communicates that he's very disgusted with this topic. Like it's inconvenient. Like it bothers him. Now, I've used Band-Aids, and I don't care what color the Band-Aid is. I mean, I'm not going to sit there bleeding all over the place and protest that Band-Aid refuses to make a dark-skinned Band-Aid. I just put it on and call it a day. But having said that, I still get what she's saying. You see, in America, certain things have become normalized to so-called black people within America. When an American company makes a product for global use, then labels the chosen color flesh tone. As a dark-skinned child, it can communicate to the mind of that child that this particular color is the standard. And the standard means normal. Now, how do I know that? Because I was that child. You see, but I could still wear a Band-Aid that is completely contrasted to my skin and have no thoughts of blaming white people for Johnson & Johnson's lack of inclusivity. My concern is the knee-jerk reaction of Ben Shapiro's defense of their lack of inclusivity. I mean, he could have easily said, yep, they sure didn't think of anyone else when they made their products back then. Huh? Until around, the 1950s, when many of these so-called people in white society started to realize that so-called black society was a market worth tapping into. So much so that they saw fit to make an instructional video for white American salespersons called The Secret Selling of the Negro. So if someone felt compelled to make an instructional video saying, hey, it turns out that Negroes like to buy stuff too. Well, perhaps many of these companies were under the impression that this so-called Negro was broke. So we have to keep in mind that this was during a time of segregation. So when white society thought of decent schools and decent education, they didn't think Negro. And when they thought American, they didn't think Negro. When they thought of Band-Aid, they didn't think Negro. Now my grandfather fought in a war to liberate Ben Shapiro's family. But when many of these so-called black people returned to America, when there was a hero's welcome, they did not think Negro. In fact, many of these so-called American soldiers preferred to eat with the Nazis rather than to eat next to a so-called Negro that had their backs in the war. So it's no surprise that a Band-Aid company that established itself in that part of America among those with that type of mindset in America would only see white as a flesh tone worth catering to. Now, the notion that Africa would have done the same thing is unfounded, which is why Mr. Shapiro had to resort to his imagination.
I would imagine that if you were a Band-Aid maker in Africa,
in order to support his defense of the practices of Johnson & Johnson.
I would imagine.
But this is old to so many so-called black people. And from what I gather, it doesn't really cause that much concern anymore, It's not until recently that certain white people are suddenly offended by things that black people have gotten over a long time ago. But here's the trick bag. You see, the idea that products made by white people reflect their culture and or phenotype because the United States is predominantly white? Yeah, no. This certainly doesn't explain why these companies sought to promote these images and logos. You would think they'd have enough negative stereotypes to display from within white society, being that America was predominantly white and all. But no. White-owned American companies picked and chose how they represented their products to their consumer base. And there were many racially inclusive images, albeit at the expense of the included race. Now, I'm not sure of your imaginary world where Africa makes band-aids for dark skin only, but I know why you had to imagine it. See, this product was made in China. Certainly wasn't reflective of the skin tone of the dominant society there either. So societies pick and choose. But take a wild guess where China got the inspiration for this logo. Right here in America. Good old Warner Brothers movie starring Al Jolson, who was being promoted by a white American company to the dominant white American consumer base at the expense of black people. Which, when he wasn't being so gregarious, he looked much different. See, but this stuff doesn't offend me. It's more amusing to see the look of disgust on white Americans when they see this subject come up. Not because they're disgusted at what has taken place in the historical record, but rather they are disgusted that you're bringing it up. So, is it white privilege to have a Band-Aid that matches your skin tone? I mean, I guess if you're self-conscious about the fact that someone might see your bobo, but I've split my fingers wide open and used fast food napkins and duct tape to stop the bleeding. So I can care less. See, to me, it's more of a privilege to know who you are, rather than to try to convince the world that you are who you really are not, especially by setting your own image as the standard representative for the entire world of consumers. Take it or leave it alone.